Interpreting natural language requires a number of primitive computational operations. Systematic mapping allows a linguistic object like the word Kamala to be interpreted in a way that is consistent across contexts and provides part of a larger meaning. Natural language also employs context-sensitive mapping, in which the meaning of a word like herself varies by context. When it is the object of a sentence with a subject Kamala, it is interpreted as Kamala, and when its subject is Stacy, it is interpreted as Stacy. True contextual variability requires more than simply memorizing a bunch of context-sensitive interpretations, like herself in the context of Kamala and herself in the context of Stacy. Rather, it demands that herself be interpretable as identical to any subject. This kind of variability requires what Marcus labels algebraic rules, and constitutes an important part of human cognition. Marcus explores the ability of SRN language models to learn such rules. For training data, he provides a corpus of sentences that are all of the form an X is an X, and then tests with novel sentences of the same form. He found that SRNs entirely fail to correctly predict the word that an algebraic rule would predict, and he concludes on this basis that SRNs are incapable of learning or representing them. Frank et al. Consider the ability of SRNs to perform semantic interpretation in the Anaphora domain. As we've already seen, reflexive interpretation requires an algebraic rule that equates the interpretation of the subject and object arguments. They train an SRN to output a semantic atom associated with each input word in a time-aligned manner. For most words, this was a simple isomorphic mapping, but for reflexives, it required outputting a token that is identical to the semantic subject. As in Marcus's experiment, they found that no generalization of reflexive interpretation to antecedents that had not occurred as the antecedent of a reflexive during training, suggesting again that the SRNs fail to learn an appropriate abstract representation of reflexive interpretation. Since then, significant advances have been made in neural network architectures that may impact their ability to perform this task. First, new types of recurrent units, like LSTMs and GRUs, more robustly encode past state. Second, sequence-to-sequence architectures have been devised using distinct encoder and decoder networks, thereby allowing more flexible mappings between input and output. Third, attention mechanisms have been devised which allow more flexible, context-sensitive access to past network state during network computation. In this work, we will consider the impact these advances have on the ability of neural networks to learn algebraic rules by exploring their success in learning abstract interpretations for Anaphora. Underlying this project are three questions. First, are modern neural networks capable of algebraic generalization in the Anaphora domain? Can they learn to interpret a reflexive with a novel antecedent? Second, what effect does lexical support have? Does the variety of antecedents for a reflexive in the training data impact the network's ability to generalize? And finally, what effect does structural support have? Does the presence of an antecedent in certain structural positions during training affect how well networks learn to generalize to that antecedent? In order to find answers, we construct a synthetic dataset consisting of simple transitive and intransitive sentences along with predicate calculus representations of these sentences' meanings. It's intended to test whether or not networks can learn a context-dependent interpretation for reflexive anaphora, not to model natural language, or explore the way in which underlying syntactic structure affects anaphora interpretation. For the experimental procedure, we follow a poverty of the stimulus paradigm. Each of our experiments involves systematically removing some class of sentences from the dataset, which form the generalization set. The remaining data are divided between training, validation, and test sets. We report full sentence accuracy on both the generalization and test sets. For each experiment, we trained 5 randomly initialized sequence-to-sequence networks, with each recurrent unit type, SRNs, LSTMs, and GRUs, both with and without multiplicative attention. We trained with stochastic gradient descent for a maximum of 100 epochs, with early stopping. The first question we want to answer is whether or not networks can learn to interpret reflexive anaphora with an antecedent they've never before seen in a reflexive context. To do this, in experiment 1, we hold out from training all sentences of the form Alice verbs herself. The models will never see Alice in a reflexive context during training, but will see other reflexive sentences like Claire verbs herself, and will see Alice in various syntactic positions in other sentences. In order to get a sense of whether or not networks are capable of interpreting reflexive anaphora at all, even with known antecedents, we first look at the test set accuracy, which contains reflexive sentences of a form not withheld during training, namely, those involving reflexive antecedent present during training. In fact, we see that SRNs, GRUs, and LSTMs achieve perfect accuracy on this set, both with and without attention, indicating that interpreting reflexives is something we can expect these networks to do. Now we look at the mean generalization accuracy, that is, accuracy on the withheld Alice verbs herself sentences, and again, we find that SRNs, GRUs, and LSTMs all do perfectly here as well. This means that networks can successfully generalize knowledge of reflexive anaphora to novel inputs. Of course, there's a concern that although networks have never before encountered Alice as the antecedent of a reflexive pronoun, they have encountered sentences involving Alice whose meaning is essentially reflexive. These semantically reflexive sentences, like Alice verbs Alice, could bias models into producing the correct output simply because they know that such logical forms exist and are valid outputs. To get around this, in experiment 2, we additionally withhold Alice verbs Alice sentences to make the task slightly more difficult for the models. Again, we check the test set accuracy and find that SRNs, GRUs, and LSTMs all perform at ceiling. Since we know that this semantic parsing task is something every type of network can do, we'll stop looking at the test set accuracy from here on out and instead focus on the generalization accuracy. And indeed, we find that SRNs with attention, GRUs, and LSTMs all solve this more challenging task perfectly. Inattentive SRNs do slightly worse, though of course this is a mean statistic, and we did find that several inattentive SRN models performed with 100% accuracy on the generalization set, even though overall they performed with about 86% accuracy. So just to pause for a moment, this is the first big result we got from our research. Contra the language modeling results of Marcus 1991 and Frank et al. 2013, seq-to-seq models with recurrent units are capable of learning an abstract reflexive meaning, which generalizes to new antecedents. Given that they are capable of this task, we now turn to the remaining questions, making the task at hand more difficult for the networks in order to understand how changes in the training data affect model performance. Our next question surrounds the lexical support provided to models during training. That is, how many different reflexive contexts do networks get a chance to learn from? In experiment 3, we conduct a series of tests in which we vary the number of withheld antecedents. This means additionally withholding sentences like Claire verbs herself and Claire verbs Claire. Note that our grammar contains two reflexives, one masculine and one feminine. Since these are distinct words which only appear in a reflexive context, it's necessary to always keep at least one feminine antecedent context present in training data. In this case, Zelda verbs herself. Here we see the mean generalization accuracy by model type as we progressively withhold more and more feminine antecedents. There are a few clear takeaways from this. LSTMs with and without attention and inattentive GRUs do superbly. It's a little bit difficult here to see the dashed light green line for the GRUs without attention, but they're actually hiding behind the two blue bars up at 100% accuracy. GRUs with attention drop off somewhat beyond 3 withheld antecedents, while SRNs drop off significantly after 6 withheld names. In general, we find that withholding antecedents does negatively impact model performance, though the degree of this impact is dependent on model type and attention. Another interesting thing to observe is the training curve for models. This lets us see how well the trained models are doing on subsets of the full dataset as the model is being trained. In this graph, for an SRN without attention when 3 antecedents, Alice, Claire, and Eliza, are withheld, we see how the network learns to interpret reflexives in a piecemeal fashion rather than all at once. We also see that the in-training antecedents, here represented by dashed lines, are typically learned before withheld antecedents, represented by solid lines. This is only one model's graph, but the pattern does hold more broadly. Another question we have is how structural support for the withheld antecedents affects performance on generalized reflexive sentences. That is, we want to know if making the withheld antecedent appear in fewer grammatical positions might make the task of interpreting it in reflexives more difficult. The structure of both the form and the meaning provides this support. We wonder both about the impact of seeing antecedents in different grammatical positions during training, as well as seeing antecedents in different semantic positions. Intransitive sentences provide an interesting point of note. Since they are unary predicates, there is ambiguity in how the single argument should be interpreted, since it is both the first argument, like a subject, and the last argument, like an object. In experiment 4a, we withhold all semantically and syntactically reflexive sentences involving Alice, as well as all sentences where Alice appears as the subject of a transitive verb, like Alice verbs Bob. Intransitive sentences involving Alice, like Alice verbs, or sentences where Alice is the object, like Claire verbs Alice, are still present in training. Here we show a violin plot of accuracy by model type on Alice verbs herself sentences. Individual dots represent separate model runs, while the shaded background represents probability density. There are a few key things to note. LSTMs with attention are excellent at this task, attaining 100% accuracy on all runs. Interestingly, SRNs with attention on average outperform the more complex attentive GRUs. Finally, we see that attention definitely does matter, with attentive networks attaining much better results than their inattentive counterparts. Although we've already withheld Alice as a transitive subject, we still wonder what effect the Alice intransitive sentences have on reflexive generalization. In experiment 4b, we additionally withhold sentences where Alice is the subject of a transitive or intransitive sentence. Now, the only place where Alice appears during training is as the object of a sentence. Here are the violin plots for experiment 4b. As we might expect, attention still plays an important role, and making the training set smaller did harm LSTM and SRN performance. However, the notable thing here is that GRUs with attention performed much better on this more difficult task, going from 26% accuracy, where only 1 out of 5 networks succeeded in generalization, in 4a, to 80% accuracy in 4b, where 4 out of 5 networks succeeded. One possible explanation for this change is that in experiment 4a, Alice has a somewhat unusual distribution, appearing only as an object or an intransitive subject. It's possible that attentive GRUs pick up on this and learn that Alice must not appear as the subject of a transitive verb, as it must in reflexive sentences, while in experiment 4b, no such negative bias exists. Another way to study the effect of structural support is to preclude Alice from appearing as the object of a sentence during training. In experiment 5a, we do just that, additionally withholding all sentences like Bob verbs Alice. Here's the violin plot for experiment 5a. LSTMs with attention continue to do well, and attentive SRNs outperform attentive GRUs. Strikingly, it seems that inattentive GRUs actually perform much better than attentive GRUs. To again make the task more difficult, in experiment 5b we withhold intransitive sentences with Alice, as well as those where Alice is the object or where the sentence is reflexive. In training, Alice is now only present as the subject of a transitive verb. Here are the performances for models in experiment 5b. Unlike in experiment 4, there are no unusual effects here, with the privation of intransitive sentences involving Alice just leading to an overall decrease in performance. Now we return to the questions with which we began. 1. Are modern neural networks capable of algebraic generalization in reflexive anaphora? Can they learn to interpret a reflexive with a novel antecedent? Here we find that yes, even the simplest architectures are capable. What effect does lexical support have? Does the variety of antecedents for reflexive in the training data impact the network's ability to generalize? We found that generalization does depend on the number of antecedents present during training, though this varies by architecture. LSTMs and GRUs generalize even with the presence of limited lexical support. Finally, what effect does structural support have? We find that the presence of the antecedent as a subject or object in non-reflexive sentences in training does affect generalization. Though we did find some interesting results, there is of course still more work to be done. Our grammar is simple, and we don't get at the fact that reflexive anaphora depend greatly on syntactic structure. We are in the process of looking at cases like the following, where correctly interpreting the reflexive requires apparent knowledge of the underlying structure. There is also a connection between our work on reflexive anaphora interpretation and components of tasks designed to test systematicity, like scan, where the twice predicate in the scan domain seems to require an analogous kind of algebraic rule. We hope to explore the degree to which success on this aspect of the scan task translates to success in the anaphora domain. Thank you for watching.